We're doing the transverse field Ising model as an example where everything I said in general terms can be worked out concretely, right? And we got to a certain point and then stopped. So let me just sketch what we said already and then we'll start from there. So we started with this Hamiltonian. And then we made the observation that if you introduce regular fermionic operators by the following procedure, supposing you write sigma z at a site j as minus the product over all j less than I of the fermion parity of these C fermions. So the idea is sigma Zj is basically a creation or destruction of a fermion except for a sign. And then we wrote down the other sigma matrices in this language. And NC is just C dagger C. Right? And somehow miraculously, when we plugged this in, we got a quadratic form in terms of fermion operators. And the quadratic form we got was minus j sum over j 1 minus 2 c dagger jcj, which is just 1 minus 2n, and then minus j sum over j that stands for taking the Hermitian conjugate of these two terms and adding them. Right? That's what we looked at. And then our job was, so it looked almost like the kind of thing we know how to work with. And what do we know how to work with in terms of fermions? If I give you a Hamiltonian free, which I write as sum over some mu, sum epsilon tilde mu, some f dagger mu f for some fermions. And you should think of this as the energy minus, well, unfortunate choice of label, sorry, k, 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 k. You should think of epsilon k as the energy, epsilon tilde k as the energy epsilon k minus some notional chemical potential. If you had this Hamiltonian, then you're back to undergraduate physics, right? Because you know that you must just take the Fermi-Dirac distribution, and in the Fermi-Dirac distribution where you see epsilon minus mu, you should stick in epsilon tilde of k, right? So then you know what the number of particles in the ground state is for any k, and that is the ground state. Then you can specify the ground state in terms of occupation numbers of these fermions at each k. So if we can rewrite that Hamiltonian like this, we said we'd be done, right? And then we proceeded to do so in the following way. Now we did make one additional point, which was that parity of sum over j and cj is conserved. By each. Yeah. So far I've taken a chain of n sites, or let's 1 to n. Well, you can call it what you like. I'm doing the problem where there are n spins, and they are connected by bonds, and they have transverse fields acting on them. Later, I will be free to take n to infinity if I like. I will be free to introduce periodic boundary conditions if I like. But right now, I'm doing the open chain of n sites. And right now, I want to keep n finite because I'm interested in knowing things about ground states as a function of n. Remember, we talked in the first lecture about the Anderson Tower of states, collapsing as a signature of symmetry breaking. You don't see that if you do a calculation completely in the thermodynamic. But what's your question? I mean, look, this is a full statement of the problem, right? What boundaries? There's nothing, there's no outside world here. It's what you would call open boundaries. There's no subtlety. You may have read somewhere that there's some subtlety with boundary conditions. So let me just be very clear. If you have open boundary conditions, there is no subtlety. And that's why we are doing open boundary conditions first. Open boundary conditions for spins is open boundary conditions for fermions. No mystery. And that's obvious just from the formulae that are written here. Look, this is a model, right? Well, I don't want to even say that. It's a model. This is the problem. The problem is to diagonalize this matrix, and we want to learn something from it, right? Let's not worry about whether it's a box or not. If you want to worry about physical realizations of the transverse field Ising model, then the best example of that Hamiltonian, like I said last time, is Columbite. And it takes a day's work to understand how the chemical formula of Columbite implies that in the low temperature limit, a good description of the magnetic excitations is provided by that. You have to know what the valence is, you have to look at the ion, you have to ask what are the crystal field effects, what's the spin orbit coupling, you have to identify what's the J of the ion, identify what's the anisotropy, and then derive the correct effective Hamiltonian, okay, and the exchange constant. And that turns out to look like this, and in that context, these would be zigzag chains like this that run through the crystal, and the whole crystal has lots of these. There's a whole array of these chains running in some strange way like this, and the coupling between chains is very weak. That's why the one-dimensional model is a good model. Okay. Now you can ask what happens to the, so it's a small rod that they do neutron scattering on. So what's your question? What happens to the last spin there? Yes. So I have not yet specified what are the eigenstates of these fermions. Where have I specified them? I have just said that if I could make this look like that for some choice of functions epsilon tilde k, then I could go back to my undergraduate physics and immediately write down what the answer is by inspection. Are we agreed on this? Right? So we have to go from here to something that looks like this. When we go to something that looks like this, you can ask, what are these functions? Right? These will be the energies of the system with open boundaries if I take open boundaries. So we are coming to that. I mean, at this stage, it must be clear that open boundaries here corresponds to open boundaries here. There is no mystery there. You should think about this. I think you may have just learnt it somewhere that there are boundary condition issues. So I'll tell you what the issue is. If you put periodic boundary conditions, then this last bond is very tricky. Okay? And it requires a lot of thought to convince yourself that periodic boundary conditions in this language corresponds to choosing a parity sector for the fermions. Okay? So that I don't want to get into. It's a small extension of what I'm doing, but not needed for what I'm doing. Okay? And the reason there is a problem is that the reason this miraculous thing happens is that the string comes up to some point, and then you have to do the C plus C dagger here, C plus C dagger here. But then you can anti-commute and get rid of the string. But for the last bond, you can't do that. Okay? Because you see, if you're doing it between these two spins, this fellow's string comes till here, the other fellow's string comes till there, And most of the string cancels. You're just left with a little bit that you have to anti-commute. For the last bond, you're not left with a little bit. You're left with the whole string. Okay? And when you work through that, keeping track of the string, recognizing that the string is nothing but the product of parities, you learn that periodic boundary conditions corresponds to a parity sector. And you're allowed to talk of parity sectors because parity is conserved. Okay? So there's no mystery at all. We could do periodic boundary conditions. That's the way it's done conventionally in textbooks without worrying about boundary conditions. People just write down Bogoliubov transforms in K space. I don't want to do that because that completely obscures the question of 0 marks. Okay? All right. But I do want to get it to look like that. And to that end, I introduce Majorana fermions. So I wrote each C as Cj was eta 2j minus 1 plus I eta 2j by 2. So roughly speaking, I introduce real and imaginary parts of each canonical fermion. Okay? Convention was odd numbered etas are the real part, even numbered etas are the imaginary part. So there's 2n etas but only n c's. Okay? I plugged it in. And remember that etas have Majorana commutators, Majorana anti-commutators. That means they square to 1 and anti-commute with each other. Okay? And having done this, I got it to look like this. Majorana. J I sum over j eta 2j minus 1 eta 2j plus j I sum over j eta 2j eta 2j plus 1. Okay. This is still not of that form, right? Yeah. That's I emphasized that last time. It went here. Z2 symmetry corresponds to the fact that parity is conserved by each. I went through that last time. Right? Flipping all Ising spins from up to down is equivalent to changing the parity of the total fermion number. The Hamiltonian conserves that. Yeah? So then we did one more thing. We said, okay, now that I've written it in terms of etas, let me introduce the way we look at Majorana fermion Hamiltonians in general. So if you have a Majorana Hamiltonian, and they are unfamiliar things, and I said if I have a general Majorana Hamiltonian which looks like this, sum over J1, J2, A, J1, J2, eta, J1, eta, J2, J1, J2 both running from 1 to 2n, then there is a standard prescription one can derive for diagonalizing this Hamiltonian and make it look like that. And that standard prescription was in terms of standard linear algebra tools, which is eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the Hermitian matrix IA. Okay, that was the next step, right? So you look at IA, and we notice that IA has this interesting structure, that it's a pure imaginary antisymmetric matrix. So if I write out its eigenvectors, they come in two blocks. There's V1, V2 like that, up to Vn. And then there's V1 star, V2 star. So they come in complex conjugate pairs. Okay? They come in complex conjugate pairs with energies epsilon and minus epsilon. Right? We found that out. Then we noticed that you can define, finally, fermions that will make things look like that. We can define F mu as sum over J V mu J eta J with a 1 over root 2 or correct normalization. This you need to check yourself. This normalization ensures that F mu dagger obey the correct canonical anti-commutation relations. Which means in addition to that, there's F nu is always 0 and F dagger nu is of course always 0. Okay? And we said in terms of these fermions and these eigenvalues, the positive ones, by definition epsilon mu running from 1 to n are these positive eigenvalues. Right? In terms of these positive eigenvalues and these fermions, last bit, our transverse field Ising model looked like minus half is just 0 point energy, you can forget about it, it's a constant. This is what allows you to now use your undergraduate physics and say what the ground state is. By definition, all the epsilon mu are positive if there are no zero modes. If there are zero modes, we agreed that we can take, they always come in pairs because these are paired up and it's an even dimensional matrix. So the zero modes, if there are any in the middle, let me put some zeros, there may be some zero modes, they must come in pairs. Then you can take pairs of them and make some extra zero mode fermions that look like this. So you will have two zero modes, let's say Z1 and Z2. So you can take Z1J eta J plus I, Z2J eta J, sum over J, 1 over root 2, and that will be your FZ1. You'll have one more fermion. And then to this sum you will add just with 0, will be plus 0, because the energy is 0. Okay? So those fermions don't have an energy. They don't appear in the Hamiltonian, but they are there in the Hilbert space, right? So now you know from undergraduate physics what is the ground state in the language of F fermions. Since all the epsilon mu are positive, none of these fermions exist in the ground state, right? So the ground state has N1F equal to 0, N2F equal to 0, everything is 0. The zero modes, if there are any, you're free to put them in or not. So you get a ground state degeneracy. Okay? Yeah. What? Whenever you talk of a chemical potential, you're always talking grand canonical, right? That's when the Fermi-Dirac distribution applies, right? If you want to start the fixed number fermions, as you learn in undergraduate physics, you fix mu by demanding that the integral over the Fermi-Dirac distribution is equal to some number. But you're perfectly, in the grand canonical ensemble, you work with a mu and you get Fermi-Dirac statistics. No, we are in a spin problem. And we have done an honest calculation that started at the end of the board and came here. And that Hamiltonian is mathematically exactly equal to this Hamiltonian. So you are automatically in the grand canonical ensemble for the F fermions. Clearly you were in the grand canonical ensemble for the C fermions already. You were creating pairs and destroying pairs, right? Okay? So I just want to emphasize there's no trickery here. This is just straight algebra, which I hope you will have done in your notebook up to this point. Yes. No, there is no natural pairing of zero modes. We just know there's even number of them. You can pair them whichever way you like to make some canonical fermions. They are just constructs to convince yourself that there is some extra degree of freedom in choosing the ground state, right? Every time there is a pair of zero modes to this matrix, you are allowed to, in the ground state, either put the corresponding canonical fermion in or not, and that's a double degeneracy. So every pair of zero modes, these are called Majorana zero modes in the jargon. Every pair of Majorana zero modes is one doubly degenerate pair of ground states. Okay? So in general, the ground state degeneracy G, right, is number is, so ground state degeneracy is 2 to the number of Majorana pairs. Zero mode pairs. Okay? Alright. So this I just want to be very clear about, because now we're going to start from here. Okay? And I want to convince you that in this problem, in one phase, there will be a pair of zero modes, and in one phase there will not be. Okay? And we will be able to estimate the splitting between the pair. In the thermodynamic limit, there is a zero mode, not in a finite system. We'll be able to estimate the splitting as a function of distance. Okay? So let's draw a picture of the matrix that we have. Okay? The whole purpose of the exercise, starting with this line on the board and going that way, is to convince you that I can just look at this and look at the connectivities that appear, draw a picture, and I should just solve the tight binding model with that picture, right? Because that's what it means to find the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of this Hermitian matrix, right? So that's what I want to do next. So here's the picture. I think I drew the picture last time, but I could not convince you of its importance. So let's draw the picture. So picture, let's draw it kind of suggestively. I'm trying to indicate that the unit cell has two sites in it, right? Why is that true? Because this is a IG. I'm using J equal to 1 now. That's the units of my energy. This is a I. This is a IG. And that is a I, and so on. And it's very important that this always ends in a pair. Because remember, this pair is actually one physical site of the Ising model. Right? So you end in a pair. So you go like this. So this is IG. And this is finally a IG. Open boundaries. Okay? By taking open boundaries, I have sacrificed my option of just taking Fourier transforms to diagonalize the matrix. But I don't want to take Fourier transforms. This is much more instructive. So now I want to solve this tight binding model. These i's are a little problematic, they're painful. You have to remember that when you hop forward, it's I, when you hop backwards, it's minus I, right? It's a pain. So let's redefine the wave function on these sides. Or I don't know, whichever one. Yeah, on these sides, I guess, in this convention. On one of the two sides, you redefine the wave function to include a factor of I. Okay? That gets rid of the I in the Hamilton. So if you like, I'll start using yellow now. Your equation was I sum over J2, A J1 J2 psi J2 equal to epsilon psi J2. That's the tight binding model Schrodinger equation, right? We're all agreed on that. Now I just define a psi tilde, right, which absorbs the I, right? On one sublattice and not on the other. Sorry, this is J1. The important thing I'm exploiting is that this matrix in our case is of the form that it always takes the left side of a pair and connects it only to the right sides. So you know there's a, B, A, B, A, B decomposition of the lattice, bipartiteness. That's just the way it worked out. Okay? The lattice is bipartite. Because the lattice is bipartite, you're allowed to say psi tilde equal to I psi on A sublattice sides and psi tilde on B sublattice sides is just psi. Yes. No, it didn't come from that. No. It actually came from the fact that our model originally had time reversal symmetry. It's a more general statement. Every time you have a time reversal symmetric model, when you write it in Majorana language, it ends up being quote unquote bipartite. Because if you had a non-bipartite lattice with a Hamiltonian that looked like that in Majorana language, that breaks time reversal symmetry. You can show that. Okay? So it has to do with time reversal symmetry. It has to do with the fact that there's a notion of time reversal symmetry that's possible to define. Okay? But that's a little technical. So if I do this, I can get rid of the i's. Okay? So let's just get rid of the i's. It's just much easier that way. And let's solve for psi tilde. The energies don't change. Okay? And I'll forget the fact that I've gone into tilde variables. Let's just solve this. Right? It's a perfectly good symmetric matrix. It's not anti-symmetric. I got rid of the i's and I got rid of the arrows. The arrows are what was making it anti-symmetric. Now it's not anti-symmetric. Good. So now can you see the significance of G very large versus G very small? Just pictorially, right? Take the G going to infinity limit of this tight binding model. What happens? You have these tightly bound molecules, right? To a very good approximation, the eigenfunctions are just symmetric and anti-symmetric combinations of these orbitals independently, right? So the energies look like, so if I plot the bands, let's erase this. So here's 0 of energy. All the eigenstates are like that, plus minus G, right? There's nothing near 0, okay? Translate that to what it means for our final answer. There's a well-defined ground state, a ground state with no fermions. Because the rule is, remember, we only take the positive energy states, stick them into that formula. So only half the spectrum exists as far as solving our problem is concerned, right? So there's a huge gap and the ground state has no particles, unique ground state. Now think about the other limit where G is very tiny. Start with G equal to 0. What happens at G equal to 0? Just a Schrodinger equation. Yeah, but waves on what? So notice that when G is 0, this doesn't exist, and that doesn't exist, and that doesn't exist, and that doesn't exist. So now you have bound molecules like that, and they give you pairs of, so these energies were plus minus G, now you will get energies plus 1, minus 1, roughly speaking. But this is a free site and that's a free site. So at G equal to 0, in addition to getting plus 1, minus 1 energy pairs, you have a pair of 0. This is just, you solve this equation, right? It's trivial. There is an eigenfunction with 1 here and 0 everywhere else that solves this problem. There's another eigenfunction with 1 here and 0 everywhere else that also solves this problem. That's the pair of 0 modes. Now turn on G. Now there's nothing sophisticated I need to do. I don't need to do many body perturbation. I just need to perturb the Schrodinger equation's eigenstates. Discrete Schrodinger equation, that, right? We know what that does. We've done this kind of calculation many times. What happens? So let's see how that happens. So even at tiny g, I can construct pretty good wave functions that are not the ideal wave functions, but almost exactly the right ones. How do I do that? I start by putting, so I can construct two different ones. I can start from the left and construct them, or start from the right and construct them. That will be the pair that will mix. That's the pair that would become the zero mode if you went to the thermodynamic. Okay? So let's do that. So start from the left, I first put 1 on the first site. Okay? To solve the Schrodinger equation here, so on all the B sublattice sites, I put 0. Okay? So I just need to determine the wave function. I'm just constructing it for you. So that's A1, the next site. What does the wave function need to become? Tell me. Solve the Schrodinger equation at this point. It has a flux of 1 times G coming from there, which must get cancelled by the flux of from here. But this bond is 1. This becomes minus G. Okay? So 1 minus G, 0 plus G square, 0 minus G cube, and so on. And since G by assumption is less than 1, it's small, this is a nicely decaying wave function. It's normalized. Okay? I can start from the other end and do the same thing. I'll get another one. Okay? In the thermodynamic limit, these start infinitely far away. They have finite correlation lengths. They don't overlap, and they are your zero modes. Right? The question is, what is it at finite length? So if you have only n sites or L sites, let's say you have L sites. Right? What should you do? Well, you should say that these are almost the correct functions, but I should just work out the mixing between them. Now there's just 2. I should work out their mixing. The mixing we know from the usual bonding on anti-bonding orbitals in molecular orbital theory, right? The mixing is proportional to this overlap, right? This is decaying exponentially, that is decaying exponentially. The overlap is also decaying exponentially in L, right? So if you want to get better eigenfunctions at finite G, at non-zero G, you would write down the matrix 0, 0, and something e to the minus L by some correlation length, something e to the minus L by some correlation length. And now this something is just an order 1 constant. There's no mystery to it, right? You can even put this problem on Mathematica right now on your laptop and get an answer in like 3 minutes. Do over site 10, 20, 30, 40, you'll see this. Right? So now the zero mode have split. So instead of and a pair of zeros, the zero mode has split by an amount that's e to the minus some constant. Right? Okay. So in one phase, when G is small, there is a doubly degenerate ground state which is collapsing exponentially. Okay? And that's the signature of symmetry field. And I think this is very important to work out in a self-contained way in this way, because when you go to fermions, unfortunately, the calculation of the correlation function, which is the other way you can say one phase as long-range order, becomes very complicated. Why is that? Because sigma z is a long product of fermion densities times the fermion creation. So if you want to calculate sigma z correlators, you would have to calculate the correlation function. I mean, you want to calculate the correlation function at far away distances from each other. You will have to calculate the correlation function of a product of operators, a huge number of them. And that becomes a giant matrix that you have to find a determinant of. That's called the Toeplitz determinant. So you can read about this if you're interested in that kind of mathematical physics. You can actually do the calculation and prove that there is long-range order in one phase and not in the other. But if you want to bypass all that and still convince yourself that there is long-range order in one phase and not the other, even in this exact solution, this is the way to do it. Okay. Are there any questions about this? Because now I'm going to completely switch gears. Okay, good. Yeah. 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 It's the ferromagnetic field. Yeah. So in fact, you can almost see just by doing this much that G equal to 1 is the critical point. Because this series doesn't converge beyond that. Wave function no longer remains, right? And that turns out to be the right answer, right? Now, if I wanted to actually write down actual formulae for all the excitation energies, it's more convenient to go to periodic boundary conditions, because otherwise I have to numerically diagonalize this tight binding model, right? But that involves the subtlety that you have to then take a fixed parity sector of the fermion problem, and that corresponds to the solution of the Ising model with periodic boundaries. Right? So that completes our sort of exact solution. Well, sure, somebody can do it, but not me. You think there's an exact answer? Um, no, I didn't try it. I just said there's no translation invariance, there's nothing I can exploit. Well, this is first of all a difference equation. You know, at least differential equations, we have some tools. So, okay, challenge to the class. Diagonalize this analytically. The point is I don't need to once I draw this picture. And by the way, this more or less convinces me that that perturbative argument I gave earlier, that was valid in any dimension, is correct. Because it's also valid in one dimension and it agrees with the exact. So the Anderson tower of states collapses exponentially in volume for Ising. The other exercise for the class, I just said something about periodic boundary conditions. Do it. Write that formula down and convince yourself that although it looks horrible, there is a way of fixing it so that it only requires you to constrain the parity of the formulas. Okay? Check that. Okay, I really want to literally wipe the slate clean now because I want to switch topics. So next, I want to tell you about how to think about gapless systems. So far, we've been very careful to talk about quasi-particle excitations in gapped systems. When systems become gapless because there are Goldstone modes in the phase because of a continuously broken symmetry, a continuous symmetry that's broken, then things get subtle. And sometimes the assumption that you have symmetry breaking itself breaks down when you analyze the effects of the gapless quasi-particles, right? And that is the first time you start needing to think a little bit better than perturbatively, and that's our entry into renormalization. Okay. So at the end of this lecture, I want to get you to the point where you appreciate the need for the renormalization. And then tomorrow we'll use the renormalization. And because this is an exact solution, I was very careful to get every factor right and every step in the argument right. Now, since what I'm doing is anyway not exact, I'll be a little bit more sloppy about some factors. You have to fill in the details, okay? Because we do want to get to some reasonable endpoint in this lecture. Okay, so I now switch notes. I'm going to define what's called the Bose-Hubbard model. Initially, it arose simply as a toy model that explains lots of things we want to understand. But now there are even experiments that trap ultra cold atoms in optical lattices, where the low energy physics is believed to be modeled well by us. But that is not our motivation, right? Because that's inverting history. Our motivation is that it's a model that is conceptually rich. So I switch from C to B to emphasize that I'm working with bosonic creation annihilation. Yeah? So imagine that these sites J, using this optical lattice picture, are the minima of some lattice potential. And you have some bosons that can live in these minima. And between minima, they have to cross this barrier, so they can only tunnel, and there's some tunneling amplitude, which I've called W, not T, for some reason. Okay, I want to use T for something else. Yeah. And I'm again thinking grand canonically. I prefer to do that. You will see why. So I have a mu, right? And this, more or less, is a crude caricature of the charging energy of this capacitor, if you wish. These bosons have some self-interaction. So if you put too many of them, the energy rises quadratic. Okay? So this is the interaction between bosons that's being modeled. Minus 1 has been put just for convenience. I could have absorbed it in mu. Okay? We want to ask what are the phases of this, the ground state phases of this model, and what are the phase transitions between them. Okay? That's what we want to do in the next 5 minutes. So let's start with a tractable limit. The tractable limit is you get rid of the kinetic energy. Okay? So now you have a problem of minimizing this quadratic function. So can you just do that for me? Just do it for me quickly, please. Tell me so work with ratios of mu to u, right? So here's an axis which is mu divided by u. Do I want to put a factor of 2? Let's see. No, that's the axis. That's the 0 of that axis. Okay? Oh, just the number of bosons. So I can get rid of it. I just wanted to emphasize this is a boson. Okay. And I'm going to anticipate that I will have another axis and keep it ready. And that's the W axis. Okay. So let's not worry about the W axis right now, because once I put the W in, I have to do quantum mechanics. Without putting the W in, I can just think classically about minimizing this energy. Right? What do I get? This translation, we are not going to look for complicated ways of minimizing it that involve changing the number across sites. The number of particles is an integer. So, no, I want to know what's the ground state. The ground state has to be in the legal Hilbert space. You have to tell me what is the integer number of particles per site as I go up this axis. You're not allowed to give me fractions, right? Because there is no way I can put fractions in this Hilbert space. Very good. 0 until mu equal to u. That's why I rigged it up so that that happens. So 0 until here. Well, not 0, 1. 1. Yeah, so NB. N equal to 10. Very good, another integer. So now you see I was wise in choosing conventions. 2, 3, and so on. So there's a change in the preferred number of particles, right? That happens at these transition points. So classically, you will say the ground state has 1 particle per site to begin with, then it has 2 particles per site to begin with, then it has 3 particles per site, right? Now let's work through in our mind what W will do. So to begin with, let's start in the middle somewhere here, far away from these degeneracy points where the system doesn't know whether, here for example, it's a bit tricky, right? System already doesn't know at the classical level whether it wants 1 particle or 2 particles. So the effect of W could be quite dramatic. And as we'll see, it is quite dramatic. But here, system is very clear classically that it wants one particle per side. What will W do? Now with the experience you have in analyzing the strong coupling limits of the transverse field Ising model, you should be able to think this through without doing the calculation. Right, so the ground state is unique. What is the first excited state? It's either a site with one extra particle or a site with one particle removed. So there's particle-like excitations and hole-like excitations. If I'm exactly in the middle between these two integers here, then both the particle-like and the hole-like excitations cost the same energy. So there's a kind of a particle-hole symmetry that's at that fine-tuned. If I go above or below, one kind of excitation will have slightly lower energy, particle-like or hole-like. Let's say you're in some general, let's not do 1. Let's go here, 4. Let's be there. Right? So then you can either come down or go up. So there's particle-like and hole-like excitations, and one will have slightly more energy or the other. So there's two kinds of excitations. Right? But both have a gap. So there's some particle and then some hole. Right? What's the leading effect of W? You have to do degenerate perturbation theory in this subspace because you can put the particle anywhere, holes are anywhere. Same as the transverse field Ising model, you do it, what happens? The particle acquires a kinetic energy. The kinetic energy will be W, proportional to W. So you will get some band structure for the particles, some band structure for the holes. The bandwidth will be order W. Totally well defined, nature of the ground state does not change. So this is a stable phase of T equal to 0 matter, right? So this kind of can be continued out except at these degeneracy points. This can also be continued out, that can also be continued out, right? So what you expect very crudely is something like that. Exactly at these degeneracy points, W will have some dramatic effect. Away from it, you will have well-defined stable phases where the system likes to have a fixed integer number of particles per side. And the kinetic energy cannot do much to change that state of affairs, right? So this is an insulating phase. It's called a Mott insulating phase. After Mott, who first thought of this in the electronic context. Remember I told you how spins come about in real life? It's when the electrons localize because of repulsion. That's an electronic Mott insulator. This is the bosonic toy model. Okay? Much easier to analyze. Okay. So now there is something that's going to happen here. And something else then will take over at the other end. We want to now think about the other end. Right? So let's now switch gears and think about the other end. So how do I want to do that? So before I do that, I should sort of do one important thing. Because the way you go from this to what's at the other side, which I've been careful not to specify yet, depends actually on how you cross this phase boundary. And let me convince you of that. So this is in the grand canonical ensemble. You might, in a real life example, as you have been insisting, want to work with a fixed number of particles. And in this case, I agree with you. Okay? So let's say you know how many atoms you put into loaded your optical trap with, and this is well isolated. The grand canonical ensemble can be a tool, but actually you must know what are the contours of constant density on this phase diagram to be able to make some predictions. Right? So let's try and sketch them by pure thought. Right? So let's ask first, where are the contours of constant integer density? So they are somewhere in the phase diagram, they start coming in, these contours. Let's take the contour of fixed density 3. So I don't know how it goes here, but as it comes in, I know that it can't go above this. So let's look at the tip of this lobe, right? Just by asking what would happen if it went above the tip of the lobe, or below, you realize it can neither go above nor below, right? Because if it's fixed density 3, why should it choose to go above and be closer to 4? Likewise, why should it choose to go below and be closer to 2? More rigorously, along this contour of equal density, equal to 3, there is this exact particle hole symmetry between 4 and 2, right? So this contour will come in and touch the tip of the lobe. So every tip of these lobes, of these Mott insulating lobes, has a sort of a whisker coming out of it, which is the contour of constant integer density, which I'm not very good at drawing, but it kind of comes out like that. And contours of density can't cross, right? So you have to make sure they don't cross when you draw pictures. Right? That's where I'll be struggling now. Now imagine you have 3 plus a little bit. Density is a fraction now. It's not exactly 3. So 3 plus a little bit. Where will that contour go? So I mean, I can convince you in a very elaborate way, but let me just draw the picture and see if you find it believable. It goes there. It skirts this lobe, sorry, picture's bad, and goes there. Next one also skirts the lobe and goes there. And here you have things coming out like that. And things coming out like that. You see what's happening? All the fractional densities between 3 and 4 go there, in this cusp between the lobes. Right? You can sort of do more elaborate calculations, but what else can happen is sort of the argument I want to give you. Right? Think about it. Okay? So those are the contours of equal density. So now you can see life is very different for a system that has integer density and is crossing this transition. Because then it must cross this transition to whatever's at the other side at a very special point. So this is a line of transitions, of quantum phase transitions, because the nature of the phase will change along this line, right? A system with integer density in the canonical ensemble will always cross it at a very special point, which is the tip of the lobe. Sounds believable? Good. So for the time being, at least, for much of what I want to do, let's focus on such systems. Okay, they simplify life a little. Because otherwise, well, it gets a little bit more complicated. Tomorrow I'll mention. So now I want to talk about a system that started, let's say, with 4 particles per side or 3 particles per side, and W started increasing some way. And this is not sort of science fiction. In these experiments, they can actually do that. They can change the nature of the optical lattice and W will increase. And you can then ask what happens to the system, right? So we want to start with 3 particles per side and ask how it crossed this guy, right? So now if I have, and I don't want to work with 3 actually, 3 is a bad example. I ran out of vertical space, but I want to work with, I don't know, 1139. I don't know, I just picked the number out of it. Big number. Point is, I want to work with a number that's fairly large. I want to work with a number that's large enough that square root of n is significantly smaller than n. And this is again a simplifying assumption because I can write down a simpler model, okay, and understand what happens on the other side in a language that makes connections with the statistical mechanics you've been learning. Okay, so I have some fixed integer density, which is this, some number I pulled out, large number. Okay, so let's now analyze what are the low energy states of interest to us if we want to look at the low temperature physics near this transition. Clearly, as we said, there's a gap to excitations of particle number higher or lower. So it's integers near this number that will play the biggest role. Those states will matter the most at each side, right? So let's examine the bosonic commutation and anti-commutation relations. Supposing I had n particles at a site, right? And I acted with B dagger J. I know, and I showed this to you explicitly, I get this. But if n is large, do I really care about the 1? Not really, right? To a reasonable approximation, when n is large, I don't care about the 1 relative to the n. So I can approximate this by square root n, and this is a simplifying approximation, which it turns out does not change the nature of the phase transition or our analysis of it, but helps our calculations. And it helps it because we make contact with some other things in statistical mechanics. So we are free to make this approximation and not worry about it. Okay? Similarly, B acting on some large integer state, I can approximate by square root n. Everybody with me here? Very good. Now ask yourself, can I represent this algebra of commutation and annihilation, commutation algebra of creation and annihilation operators more simply in language that you kind of can make contact with? Think about what. So if this is just a constant, now this is a constant because all the nj's, so I should say and NAV is whatever integer density lobe I might. You know, this 1139, right? So that's just a constant now. So if this is just a constant, I don't need to worry about this one at all. It can be a prefactor. So I should be able to write B and B dagger as some constant prefactor times some other operator, right? The other simplification, if I've got large n, is that I don't need to worry that the number of holes I can make is limited to 1139 because I can't have less than 0 particles, right? So actually the number of holes I can make is limited. But since that's so far down and that state having 1139 holes or having 0 bosons is so high in energy that if I'm interested in the low temperature physics, I don't need to worry about the fact that there's a floor. As long as it doesn't lead to any pathologies in my calculation, I don't need to worry about it. So I can assume that these n's now range from minus infinity to infinity, integers. So I'm messing with the spectrum, I'm messing with the operator algebra, but in a way that I'm quite confident doesn't change any of the low temperature physics, right? Now consider the auxiliary problem of a particle on a circle. So here's a circle, there's a quantum mechanical particle that lives on it, right? And its plane wave modes I can write as e to the I theta, right? And its angular momentum of going round and round, which is its kinetic energy, I can call n, right? Operator n, okay? And we have the commutation relation n e to the I theta equal to e to the I theta. This is just the exponential form of the usual x. So the usual p x equal to minus I. If you can translate that to ask what is the commutator of p with e to the ix, that's what you would get. But for an angle, this is a more convenient way of writing that. You must have done this in some quantum mechanics, right? This is just a particle on a circle, okay? So now, if I make a correspondence between that and that, I can say that these integers are these angular momenta of these rotors, these particles on imaginary circles. So it's like every site of your original problem has got replaced by a little circle in some other space, some imaginary space. And there's a particle that can go round and round that, and it can have integer valued angular momenta. Those integer valued angular momenta are precisely the number of bosons that I'm talking about shifted. This is important thing. This I will now write as square root NAV minus 1. So if I have NAV minus 1, so I only count whether I have how different I am from the preferred integer. So I can be at the preferred integer, that would be 0, or I can be 1 less, that would be minus 1, and so on. And these differences, so now I can people read this? I can now make the operator identification n at a site j in this auxiliary problem is nj minus nf, right? And I can make the, let's write inside the circle, oh now it's needed. Now I can make the identification b j is square root NAV e to the minus I theta j, right? It's clear given this commutation relation that these two identifications exactly reproduce this approximate action I've written down. So we're doing something unusual. Usually you're used to approximating wave functions. Here we have approximated commutation waves. That's okay. It's valid, right? Clearly. Any questions about this? If you haven't seen things like this before, it might be slightly hard to digest, so let me know. Is this clear? Good. So this is what we are going to use now. And the advantage is life becomes very simple when I rewrite the Hamiltonian. Okay. So let's do that at the other end now. Yeah. What? I've just made the following op. So let me write it here. I myself can't see that end actually. Let me write it here. I'm making the identification that the boson number, which I'm now writing capital just to make a distinction, that operator, right, is minus that average operator, is being represented by the angular momentum of this fictitious rotor. Maybe I should have called it little n. And I'm saying the operator that was going to create an extra particle, right, acting on n. So that's right, acting on nj minus nav. Just to emphasize that I want to measure everything from that, right, is going to be written as square root nav e to the I theta g. That's it. This is so it's an approximate operator identity that this is a true statement, right? And that. So this and this are my tools to simplify the problem. And at the back of your mind, you should imagine that there's this internal space where there's a rotor, particle on a circle, living at every side j. It's just, you're going to get a model from statistical mechanics. After all, when you write down StatMech models, you talk of all sorts of variables, Potts variables, Ising variables that live at sites. So here I have an angle theta and its conjugate angular momentum n living at the side. Okay? And this is rigged up to exactly reproduce all the low energy states and their relationships in a high loop. That I've established. We know what BJ does. There's no, it's the boson creation operator. So exactly speaking, if I had taken this, I would have got square root nj plus 1 times nj plus 1 minus. Right? This is just notation. I would have got square root nj plus 1 as the matrix element. The claim I'm making is that if I'm at states near nav, all those square roots can be replaced by square root nav. And then the residual action, which is the raising, is correctly captured by this. Why is it correctly captured by this? What is the wave function of the particle which has angular momentum n? It is e to the I n theta. If you multiply e to the I n theta by e to the I theta, what do you get? You get e to the I n plus 1 theta. So you have gone from n to n plus 1. That's exactly what you want to do, right? So that's why it's an exact correspondence modulo this fudge. Yeah. Advantage is you get a model that you recognize. If you didn't know many body theory, but you know lots of StatMech, you get a model you recognize. Okay. In the model, translated low energy Hamiltonian becomes some parameter little t, that's why I called the other thing w, cosine theta I minus theta j plus some other parameter. I actually call this j. Let's make the analogy even more precise in notational terms. Sum over j nj square to kappa. Okay. So if I didn't have this quantum mechanical term that doesn't commute with it, what have I got? I've got the d-dimensional classical XY module, right? In this particular school, you've not got to XY modules, you talked about icing, pods, so on, but you know about XY modules, right? So planar spins, classical, just an angle, right? So, and what's the correspondence? J effective is proportional to W. Right? You can stick this into the original one and expand. Why did I get cosine? Because I had B dagger I, Bj. That's e to the I theta I, e to the minus I theta j. So e to the I theta I minus theta j. And then the Hermitian conjugate. So you get cosine. Okay? Nothing mysterious, you can write this formula down. Okay? And this is just saying that both particles and holes cost the same energy. Right? Because you are at this particle hole symmetric integer filling. So that's why we wrote a quadratic one. If we were looking at some other density contour, right, then there would be a linear term as well, because then either particles would cost more or holes would cost more. So little n, so positive integers would not have the same energy as negative integers. Negative integers, remember, are holes, positive integers are particle excitations. They would not cost the same energy. So there wouldn't be this symmetry of n going to minus n if you are not at an integer filling, integer density contour. And that's why I chose an integer density contour. It's nicer to have a symmetry like this. It's in closer correspondence to StatMech. We'll see. Any questions so far? You have that energy, right? U into n minus 1 minus mu. You yourself minimized it and found that. So find out how much it costs to go above or below. That's 1 over 2k, right? So 1 over 2k will be proportional to u. So I should perhaps say that 1 over k be proportional to u, right? So u very large corresponds to k very light or a very light particle. See, this is the mass of the particle that's going round and round in the circle. This is like p square over 2m, except that it's on the circle, right? So very large u corresponds to very light particles. You know, very light particles are very quantum mechanical in nature. And so this Mott insulator is a very quantum mechanical thing. It's only because it's quantum mechanics that things are quantized, you're fixed at integer densities and so on, right? That in this language is this highly quantum mechanical limit of vanishing mass, u extremely large, right? On the other hand, if u is very tiny, that means I'm very far away here in the phase diagram, right? Then it's a really heavy particle, which I can think of classically. And all the things I said earlier when I was talking about symmetry breaking for crystals, remember I said cricket balls I don't need to think about in terms of wave functions, wave packets localized at a site are good enough, all that applies. Really heavy particle. What does a really heavy particle do? It sits wherever you put it. So what will that particle want to do? It will simply want to line up its coordinate with its neighboring particles to minimize the potential energy, right? So that's your two phases already. You see now the advantage of this language? I didn't know what this phase was. Now I know what it is. It's a phase that spontaneously breaks the symmetry. The symmetry is the symmetry of rotations of this angle. That symmetry in original variables is a little abstract, right? It's the symmetry that is related to particle number conservation in the original language, right? No, particle number conservation. It's the U1 symmetry of particle number conservation in original language that is being broken. Why do I say that? Because look, what happens if I keep theta fixed at some particular number? What's being violated? The symmetry of rotations around the circle, right? That's the symmetry that's being broken. This is the circle's coordinate. If you choose a particular value, so here's the circle. If every particle wants to line up there on the lattice, why not here? Why not here? Why not here? Everything I said in the first lecture about symmetry breaking applies, right? No. Fixing a particle number at all sites is equivalent to saying you're a very light particle and you want to be in a plane wave with zero momentum. Wave picture of particles. So that is an eigenstate of n. Fixing the particle number corresponds to the state momentum eigenstate and at equal to 0. Very heavy particle corresponds to position eigenstate. Position can be arbitrary in classical mechanics if the potential energy doesn't choose it, and here the potential energy just says relative position must be the same. So fine, put all the positions equal at the same angle, right? So that's a position eigenstate. That has broken a symmetry, right? What is that symmetry in original language? It's the symmetry of particle number conservation. That's been known. So what is this state in original language? It's a superfluid. And how do I see that? Well, that's a little bit of a digression. You've probably seen it in the classroom. So I don't go there, right? I just emphasize that everything I said about the crystal applies here. And that's why I was so slow in the first lecture, because I knew I wanted to speed up now. What is preventing these vectors, which are all locked like this, from just changing their direction, right? Answer? The answer is that this degree of freedom, which is this coherent motion of all the vectors, it's like the rigid motion of the crystal, same thing. So it has a very large mass associated with it, which is the individual particle's mass times the number of particles, right? So again, if I look at the rigid rotation, so what is the tower, Anderson tower? What is the Hamiltonian that gives me the Anderson tower of states here? It's simply n total square divided by 2 times L to the d kappa, right? N, well, whatever, n center of mass, the analog of the center of mass, right? On a circle, the analog of the center of mass. So again, the eigenstates are very closely spaced. Spacing goes down as 1 over L to the d in d dimensions, right? And you can make a wave packet out of them, which costs very little spread in energy, therefore lives forever. And that wave packet can localize your particle to whatever accuracy you want so that it always points here and doesn't move. Right? So that's your symmetry beam. Okay? What does that mean in physical terms? What am I doing here? I'm superposing lots of different little n's. Right? What does superposing lots of little n's mean? It means superposing states with different number of particles in the original problem. So the wave function of the superfluid is a wave packet where the total number of particles is in a spread of energy, a spread of integers. Spread of order square root n. Average is n, spread is square root n. That's the wave packet that's stable. Okay, that's a superfluid. Okay, that breaks the symmetry. So on the one side you have a Mott insulator, on the other side you have a superfluid, in the middle you have a quantum phase field. Okay. Now it's all coming together. Everything I said again is getting repeated. Right? Sorry? You can think of the common value of theta as the phase of the condensate wave function, if you are familiar with this language. Okay? But if you are not familiar with this language, don't worry. What I have written on the board is self-contained. It's clear from this that a symmetry is broken. The symmetry is the one that corresponds to rotations of this phase, and that's particle number conservation. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Yes, but I prefer not to write that because, no, I mean, theta is an angle, right? So it's better to write the one I wrote, which is n e to the I theta equal to e to the I theta. It's completely equivalent to the position moment. But this is sort of well defined without any ambiguity of theta going to theta plus 2 pi. Because the physical variable is the direction, not theta. Better to write this. Okay? Alright. Now we come to something very important. Remember in the case of the crystal, apart from this Anderson tower of states that was collapsing, we argued that there will be some Other modes that will come to 0 in the symmetry broken frame, that will only come to 0 as 1 over L, not 1 over L to the G. Right? And I said that's a general consequence of symmetry breaking when the symmetry that's broken is a continuous one. So we expect that to happen here. Right? So let's see that. That's the next thing. Okay. How much time do I have? 14 minutes. Very good. I'm going to get to the end. Okay. So, if J effective is very large and kappa is also very large, so kappa comes in the denominator. So, both being very large means you just look at the cosine, right? That's the dominant term. So, all the thetas will want to point together except for small fluctuations. So, if the typical configurations that matter are all lined up along some angle plus minus some deviation, small deviations, I don't need to worry about this whole periodicity business. The theta and theta plus 2 pi are the same thing. I can ignore that for the time being, just to worry about the linearized. So I can just replace the cosine by its quadratic approximation, right? And get, let's write that down. Let me get my notation now. Okay. Okay. So you get H small fluctuations equal to some constant into sum over J prime theta J minus theta J prime square. That some constant is what I get when I expand the cosine to quadratic. Right? Plus 1 over 2 kappa sum over J. This doesn't change. Right? And now what Abhishek said becomes relevant. If I'm not worrying about the periodicity, then I just need to take this version of the commutation. Theta J n J prime is I delta J. Commutation relations between x and t. Right? I don't need to worry about e to the I. Can you diagonalize this for me? So can you do the diagonalization? Okay. So let's see how I want to name these constants. Yeah, let me continue to call this J by 2. So how do you diagonalize it just in words? I don't want to go through the process. You've done it in class somewhere. How do you do it just in words? No, I'm looking for the golden phrase Fourier transformation. Right? So you Fourier transform, go to K space because it's translationally invariant, and it looks diagonal there. But you're right, I do in the end want to define creation and annihilation operators. So let me do that. First, let's go to Q space. So let's define a Q space version of that momentum, phi of Q, sum over all the sides. This is a vector, I'm not going to worry about the e to the I Q x j n j. Right? And I'm going to be a little bit clever with some hindsight. You're going to see that it's useful to define theta of Q with the minus sign. That makes the formula look nicer. If I do this, you should be able to convince yourself very, very quickly that the commutation relations between theta of Q and phi of Q prime in a big system of n sites is I n sites delta Q comma Q prime. Okay? Using box normalization. Okay? And that's why I chose a minus sign. Otherwise, I would have had a nice commutation relation where Q and minus Q prime. And the linearized guy in Fourier language, Fourier transformed, looks like 1 over n sites, sum over sum over q, 1 over 2 kappa mod pi q square. This is an operator still, don't forget. Plus 1 over n sites, sum over q, a particular function which I'll write down in a minute, j by 2 some b square of q times mod phi q square. This is now interfering with the formula, so let's erase it. This takes 5 minutes to get all the factors right. Please do it later. Okay. Now we come to this creation annihilation. I want to make it look like a harmonic oscillator, right? So there's a standard way to do that. You kind of fiddle around with the constants to get everything right. I've done it, so let me write it down for you. You define this to be 1 over square root 2 n sites. Again, please check all these factors. Kappa. So, I should say, let us define, I never wrote down for you this b square. This cares about the lattice. You need something that says what lattice you Fourier transform, right? So this is the hypercubic lattice in d dimensions, let's say. Then b square of q is the standard thing. It's 2d minus 2 cos qx minus 2 cos qy, right, d of that. And if I absorb this j into that and define a omega square of q equal to, and I want to take this kappa as well, j by kappa b square. So with those definitions, this will become my frequency that goes into the definition of the A's and A daggers. And it's a positive number always because I take the positive square root. Theta q plus I pi minus q by square root kappa omega, and then A dagger of course follows. This is just straightforward algebra of the type you've done many times in class, and I've already in a self-contained way told you about creation annihilation. So there's no need to just dwell on this. Let's write down the answer. In the end, this linearized guy, using that definition, becomes, hurrah, we've got what we wanted, omega of q, b dagger, well, A dagger, q a q plus half. This is a vector, of course. Okay, subject to box normalization. So I know the frequencies for these harmonic oscillators. Every q is an independent harmonic oscillator. Ground state has no particles, no excitations. These are the quasi-particles I was talking about when I talked about modes coming down 1 over L. Right? Why 1 over L? Look at this frequency. What's the energy? It's the frequency. What's square root of this? Square root of this is square root of qx square plus qy square plus q square. So it's mod q. So that's why linearly in the volume. Because by dimensions, if you have an energy going as q or mod q and you're in a L by L by L system, then the finite size effects will mean that the energy is order 1 over L. Right? Okay, so this is an ansatz. I said in this limit, this is a reasonable ground state. Let's expand about it, and I seem to have got something sensible. Consistent picture. Symmetry is broken spontaneously. There are Goldstone modes. They're described by these omega of q's. Everything's good. So I've described both phases of the phase diagram I rubbed out. I've not yet talked about the transition. Right? But it's very important to have a picture of the phases before we talk about the transition. Tomorrow we'll talk about it. Yeah? But there's a catch. And the catch is my last point. Can you do, maybe we do it in tutorial. can you do the undergraduate physics exercise now of estimating the mean value of how should I put it? The RMS fluctuations of theta. Okay. So we have expanded about theta equal to 0. So in the ground state, all the spins are pointing along theta equal to 0. But there's some fluctuation, right? Which you can work out. Right? It's like asking what's the mean of x square in the harmonic oscillator. Right? Except that there is one contribution coming from each motor. I want to know what is theta j square sum over j 1 over n sides equal to what? So I suggest that in the tutorial, you guys, and we won't do this now, you do it, okay? Work this out, okay? And write it as a momentum integral over moles. Yeah. In your thing, they know the answer? Great. Okay, let me just, I didn't want to do it anyway. So, who did it? You did it together. Can you quote the answer? I don't need to, I just need the answer. Yeah, no, I don't even want you to do the integral. I just want you to write down the integral for me. Then I'll talk a little bit around it. What is M? Sorry, N, what is N? No, so you have to just use the Bose-Einstein distribution at 0 temperature, or so you can, yeah, it's okay. No, but let's do it. Let's write the full answer down. I mean, it's another 5 minutes, so let's write it down. So the answer should be that it's equal to 1 over square root kappa times j integral over the Brillouin zone d to the dq over 2 pi to the d 1 over square root at 0 temperature. This is the answer at 0 temperature. T equal to 0. 2d minus 2 cos qx minus 2 cos y da 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 da. Okay. Now this fellow clearly so this is mod q, 1 over mod q. So dq over mod q is logarithmic, right? No. What? What are you saying? In 2 dimensions is logarithmic. No, so look, don't, no, hang on. So I should say over the Brillouin zone is very important. You're not looking for ultraviolet divergence. Where's the n? There's no n now. This is in the thermodynamic limit. Yeah. Okay. All right. And now what's the answer at finite temperature? Let me write that down from my notes. There's an extra factor. Okay. There is the same business. It's 1 over the same constant integral over the Brillouin zone d to the dq over 2 pi to the d. Now you have to use the full Bose function. So it's this 1 over omega q, which is the square root, and you get 1 plus 2 divided by e to the omega q by t minus 1. Okay. So this 1 is the 0 temperature, 1 is that. Okay. But you see, anytime temperature is non-zero, this gives another 1 over omega q. Right? So at any non-zero temperature, it's worse. So this is like doing the integral d to the dq over omega q. This is like doing integral d to the dq over omega square q. Okay, very good. So now you can see that you're in bad trouble. You made a reasonable assumption that things are lined up, but that gives an inconsistent answer because the integral diverges, right? It diverges in 1 and 2 dimensions at non-zero temperature, and it diverges in 1 dimension at 0 temperature. So long-range order, spontaneously broken symmetry of the type I described in the first lecture appears to be inconsistent, right? Now this is a bad thing, right? You started with a reasonable assumption, it just blew up in your face. How are you supposed to fix it? So what you need to ask is, what went wrong? What went wrong is the very low momentum modes. That means fluctuations that happened at very large length scales. Low momentum is large length scales. Low wave number is very large length scales, right? So you need to carefully take into account what those fluctuations do. Things that happen at high momentum are not so important, right? So what you need to do is sort of solve the problem in multiple steps. You need to say, I need to be really careful about the low momentum modes. Let me not touch them. Let me not make any approximations. But we can be a little bit more relaxed about how we treat the high momentum guys. And this can be made into a systematic procedure, which Mustansir has already started describing in slightly different language, which I will now use tomorrow to first answer the question, how do I think about situations like this where the reasonable assumption blows up in my face? What happens, right? I want to be a bit more quantitative than say, oh, I assume long range order and the fluctuations blew up, sorry, right? I want to be able to say, okay, so fluctuations blew up, so it's not long range order. What is it, right? So that is what we will answer tomorrow, and in the process introduce the renormalization group. And when we introduce the renormalization group, we'll also be able to use it with very little extra effort to talk about quantum phase transition. Okay, so that's the last lecture.